Howdy, folks. Can photography actually save wildlife, or is it just a way for us to capture beautiful moments while the world around us is quietly disappearing? Today's guest didn't just ask that question, she turned it into a global movement that has raised over 1.25 million pounds for conservation projects around the world. Right after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, where we bring you the insider scoop on all things photography and videography, giving you a unique opportunity to stay ahead of the curve. We've spent literally hundreds of hours interviewing some of the most renowned photographers of our time, giving you access to knowledge and expertise that's just not available anywhere else. And as always, I'm your host, Kirsten Nuts. And if you're like me and you enjoy free podcast and YouTube content, you can support the show by buying us a coffee over on buymeacoffee.com/Camera Shake to help us keep creating more great episodes for you. But of course, you're more than welcome to say no, no hard feelings at all. Just know that your support really does make a difference. And if you feel like you want to represent the show, you can now grab Camera Shake merch over at camerashakepodcast.com. Go check it out. Do me a favor, camerashakepodcast.com. Anyhow, without further ado, let's dive into today's episode with the founder of Remembering Wildlife. Please welcome Margot Raggett. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
So Margot, there isn't a T on the end.
Oh, okay. I'm never sure with these things. I was thinking, like,
Yeah.
do you pronounce it Roger or is it?
I know. So I confused, yes, because it's a silent T on Margot, but not on the surname. So
Right.
apology.
Anyway, Margot, how are you doing? Thank you so much for being on
I-
Camera Check Broken.
Yeah, no, I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Margot, I know that originally you didn't really start out in photography. You started out in PR. Um, what was it that made you change career?
A few things. Firstly, my grandfather was a photographer, so I grew up seeing slideshows from him on one of those old-fashioned carousels in a dark room that he would show me. So I kind of loved the idea of photography, and I had inherited a camera from him. And then in the course of my career in PR, I was commissioning photography a lot. So we would put together like corporate brochures and photo shoots for people. So I would be the one working with a photographer, telling them what I needed and choosing the images afterwards. So I always had a bit of an eye for photography, but wasn't really doing it myself. But what started for me is actually falling in love with safari and wildlife. Firstly, I went on a safari because I was visiting a friend in South Africa, and she said, if you're coming all this way, you might as well try and grab a few days on safari because you never know, you might never go again. So she now takes credit for everything I've ever done since, because that very first game drive, I saw a newborn giraffe, and then I saw a leopard mother with two cubs, and I fell in love completely with safari and found it an amazing way to switch off from the kind of stresses and strains of the office. But it was a few years of going on safari after that I signed up to a photographic safari unwittingly. So I signed up to one led by TV's Jonathan Scott, who was a presenter on a BBC show called Big Cat Diary. And I thought, oh, I've heard of him. That sounds like it would be a good trip. Kind of, put it in the diary. And the night before, read the paperwork, and it said, don't forget your camera and your camera book. And I thought, what camera? And so I bought one on the way to the airport, and I bought a kit Nikon camera because I thought it sounded cooler than Canon. Literally no idea. And the kit that I bought was terrible. It was like the most basic kit with terrible ISO capability, and the maximum zoom was like 70 or something. So it was no good for safari, but I was inspired by him and his wife, Angela Scott. Both of them have won Wildlife Photographer of the Year individually, amazing photographers. And they show just how beautiful wildlife imagery could be. And I thought, I want to get better. I want to be like them. So that was the first inspiration for me to start moving across and away from my previous life.
Now, I've got to ask this: did you when you first picked up the camera back then? Did you think that this was going to lead you to becoming an MBE? And for our for our listeners and viewers across the pond, just explain what an MBE actually is.
An MBE is part of the Royal Award system in the UK. The King of England twice a year gives out awards that range from, sometimes people are knighted or made dames, which is a very top award you can get. And then there are various other awards like an MBE and OBE. And yes, in 2023, I was given an MBE by on the King's inaugural birthday honours list. So I say it's inaugural because that was his first list after the Queen had passed away and he became king. And that was for services to international wildlife conservation. So yes, I'm now officially Margot Raggett MBE and can use those letters after my name, which is, I forget sometimes actually. So it's, thanks for the reminder. And absolutely no, of course, it didn't occur to me. I was very frustrated at this camera that I was kind of jabbing at, and literally sitting next to people in safari vehicles who'd had huge lenses, while at my little stubby lens could not take a picture of that animal, a mile away in the way that they could. And I was bewildered as to why, but I wanted to know more. So actually after that trip, the first thing as I did was sign up for a course at the London School of Photography. So I took a week off work, did a week of kind of 9 till 5 going in, and really learned the basics of shooting on manual and understood how, all the different settings play to give you, light ultimately. And yeah, I found it fascinating and I loved it. So I knew I had an eye for what I thought was a good picture because I'd commissioned a lot. But then I was like, well, now I need to learn how to actually take one, which was the next step.
What do you wish you'd known back then that you know now?
Um, Golly, that a lot of factors. I worked this out over time. A lot of factors play together to get great shots. So it isn't just whether you're an amazing photographer, technically clever, instinctive, artistic. You've also got to be there when the magic happens as well. And so it takes time because you could be the best photographer in the world, and we've worked with many of them at Remembering Wildlife, that they could be sat next to me in the same vehicle and both of us will get no shots because just nothing happened that day. So I suppose one other thing I'd add is that photographers only show their best work. They don't show you the work that didn't rank, that they just threw away, or that they even didn't take. So you look at some images by photographers, you think, my God, I'll never be as good as them. But 99% of their stuff is stuff they'd never show anyone. So yeah, don't judge yourself by the very best shots from other people. Strive to only show your very best shots.
Um, do you think that starting in photography a little bit later and having had a career in PR beforehand, do you think that gave you a certain advantage in the end?
I mean, I think that the advantage it has given me is that everything I learned before enabled me to do what I do with Remembering Wildlife. If I hadn't had the corporate background, if I hadn't learned how to run a business and to be organized and to manage long-term projects, I wouldn't have been in a position to start the Remembering Wildlife organization. And I realize that gives me an advantage over other people, lots of other people who have only ever, pursued photography because they don't know how to run a spreadsheet, for example, which, the the majority of what I do is sit behind a computer nowadays. It isn't the glamour of just sitting watching wildlife. It's doing all the drudge that comes with running a business. But I've learned that over many years, and I often think that my whole life was kind of building up to the point that I could do what I do now. If I hadn't done all of that before, I wouldn't be making a difference with remembering wildlife in the way that I've been able to.
So I want to talk about remembering wildlife a little bit. What was that defining moment that made you realize that rather than just taking pretty pictures of animals in the wild, the, the aspect of conservation was was so important?
There was a pivotal moment, which I'll come on to in a second, which made me really determined to start it. But I had been feeling for a while like I needed to do more or something with my photography. So I had been to cut the kind of journey short. I'd met Jonathan and Angela. I had gone on the course at the London School of Photography. I'd gone on a lot of safaris with photographers trying to learn from them and get different hints and tips as to how to get shots. And then I got myself to a point that I had enough of a following that I could work with a camp. So I approached the camp in the Masai Mara and said, let me be your resident photographer. I will produce content for you. I will teach your guests wildlife photography that I'd learned at that point. I'll help you with your marketing because I've got a background in that. And happily, a camp called Entim Camp said yes to me. So for 4 years, I worked 3 months a year there. So I spent the best part of a year of my life out in the Mara over those 4 years. And I would go out twice a day on game drive. I had a vehicle to myself. Guests would sometimes come with me, but if not, I was going out looking for content that I could create, or animals to photograph rather, to not use the jargon. And it was wonderful. And I particularly spent a lot of time looking for leopards, which are always my favorite thing to photograph, animal wise. But I just got to a point where I felt like I've got a great portfolio here. I've got so many shots that I've always dreamed of, and what am I doing with them? And I can put out another picture and I can try and get more likes tomorrow, but what am I actually doing for these animals who are sitting there? And yes, I would encourage anyone and everyone to go on safari, because by going to these places and paying your park fees or your conservation fees, you are giving back. But equally, I just knew I wasn't doing anything more than that. And so I was searching for a purpose at that time. And then one day I was in the Kipia in northern Kenya, and we got woken up in camp very early by the sound of a lot of hyenas going crazy. So we went to investigate at first light, and what we found is an elephant, a young bull elephant. We think he was about 14 years old. He still had his tusks intact, but he had been poisoned by a poison arrow from poachers. And I just was apoplectic with anger and upset. I'd been photographing elephants the day before, and I said to the guides, what on earth has happened here? And they said, do you not know how bad the poaching crisis is? It's hundreds of elephants are being killed a day, thousands a year for their ivory. And I had an epiphany that it's very easy when you go and sit in a fancy safari camp, that you're shielded from the reality of the conservation issues that animals are facing in the area. The camps don't tell you, understandably, because they're trying to paint this kind of beautiful utopia that you can sit and sip your gin and tonic and watch the elephants go past in sunset. And you don't know that when they go over that hill, they can run into farmers and have human wildlife conflict. There are snares there that they might get caught in. There are people trying to shoot them for their ivory, and all the other issues that I could go on and on. But and once I knew that, I kind of couldn't unknow it. And I thought, how do I spread the word? And you talked about wanting to discuss what difference photography can make in this podcast. And, I took some very powerful pictures of that poached elephant, and I thought, I could tomorrow go out and post this on social media and say, look, isn't this awful, everyone? And people might react, and then it will be forgotten in a day or two and life will go back to normal. Or I can really do more with this. And that's what kind of got me starting to think, how can I use my skills to make a difference here? What else could I do with this one image? Which actually never appeared in the book, interestingly, for reasons I can go into. But so yeah, that's what set me off on this path.
How did you get from starting or sort of, what's the word? From starting out with the idea to then actually growing it into what it is today? What was the process?
Well, I didn't ever imagine it would grow into what it is today. And the same as I never imagined I'd get an MBE for my work, but one step at a time. So I started by thinking, let's try and do either an exhibition or a book or both on elephants to raise awareness of the issues that they are facing, and to also raise some funds for those organizations working to protect them. Because I always thought and was very determined that raising awareness wasn't enough, but preaching to the converted, which probably are the people that I would reach, is not going to save another elephant's life. And I thought if I can do anything to save one other elephant from going through what that one I'd seen had gone through, then that's what I wanted to do. So fundraising and awareness raising. So I ended up deciding on a book. I wanted 50 photographers to contribute because, again, I was very aware that although I'd built up a bit of a following on social media, not enough people were going to buy a book by me to really kind of make a difference. But actually, if I could get the best known wildlife photographers in the world to donate an image each, and collectively they did that, that would really get noticed. And again, that's all my skills from PR and marketing. I knew what would make a good story and what would get noticed. So I spent about 6 months working out the logistics, finding an editorial team, where I'd print it, how much it would cost if I was going to do this. And then once I had and also how I was going to fundraise for it. And so I decided on using Kickstarter because I'd seen another photographer who actually has been in every single one of our books from the beginning, called Will Burrard Lucas. He'd done a really successful campaign in those days to fundraise for his own book. So I kind of picked his brains as to how to do it. And I started writing to photographers. And I remember the first email I sent to someone I didn't know. So I'd approached a few who I did know because I'd seen them rounded about in the Mara and different places. But the ones I didn't know, the first email was to Marcel van Oosten, who went on to be crowned Wildlife Photographer of the Year in 2014. But he was already a really big name. And he had a beautiful image of an elephant on the top of Victoria Falls, which was very famous. And I thought, I want that image. So I wrote to him and said, "You don't know me, you're going to have to trust me. I can do a good job on this, but please let me use your image for free in this book. And this is what I'm trying to do." And kind of sent it off and held my breath. And I knew that as soon as I sent that email, if he wrote back and said yes, I had to do it. I couldn't, I could not follow through on this promise. So I was committing myself to at least a year's worth of work. But I sent it, and very quickly he replied and said yes. And then the ball started rolling. And actually, having not known 50 photographers, so in those early days, I was researching images, finding images I liked, and writing to the photographer. I would also say to those, do you know anyone else who's a big name in photography who, might be willing to be part of it? People started writing to me and saying, "I'm here, you're doing this, and, we'd love to help you." And so we flipped from not having enough photographers into the kind of very delicate balancing act I now have to try and manage, which is more photographers wanting to be in the book than I can possibly fit in, and trying not to hurt anyone's feelings who wants to help. So yeah, and so then that first book, to cut it short, we managed to fundraise on Kickstarter. We raised the £20,000 I set out to raise, which would have printed 1,000 books. That year we raised it in 12 hours flat. This year, for Remembering Giraffes, which is currently, as we're recording, still live for another 2 weeks, we raised it in under 5 minutes, which is just amazing. But yes, and so we raised the money, and it took me a year to publish Remembering Elephants. It came out in 2016. And it sold out in 2.5 months flat. It raised £100,000. And everyone started saying, "What's next?" And genuinely, I hadn't considered at that point that there would be a second book. It was so much hard work to get to that point, and everything was for the first time, learning, on an event at the Royal Geographical Society, and everything in between. So there was such momentum and such support and encouragement from people, and I decided I would do a second book when I was out in Kenya just shortly after the launch, which was on rhinos. Suddenly I find myself 11 years down the track working on the 11th book. So there was no vision that I'd get to this point, but I feel like I'm riding a wave that it would almost be shameful to step off. While there's encouragement and support and enthusiasm, and we're making a difference, and we're raising awareness, and we're raising funds, then it would kind of be shameful to not continue to carry on, basically.
How has the landscape changed in terms of wildlife conservation? You mentioned animals being poached for the ivory, elephants are being poached for the ivory. How has that changed over the last 11 years? What is the situation like now compared to 11 years ago? Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platyball tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps.
The disappointingly honest answer is that generally not a lot has changed. There have been successes, and certainly elephant ivory poaching has gone down a lot, primarily because the Chinese government banned ivory. And that was the biggest factor that could make a real difference. So really killing kind of demand rather than the supply side of things. But where elephants were suffering for poaching, they're now suffering mainly for human-wildlife conflict. So as there are more and more people being born, and I think there's been a billion more on the planet in the last 11 years from when I started, more land is needed for them to live on, but also to graze their livestock and to grow crops, which means that traditional places that I'm talking about elephants, for example, here, would go now is farmland and the elephants trample crops and then they get retaliated on. And the story is the same worldwide. So one thing that really surprised me over the years, because I suppose it's because I hadn't thought about it, but we've done so many species now, from tigers to lots of African species, all land mammals at this point. But we also did bears a few years ago. And so then I was looking at issues with bears in North America and Southeast Asia. And again, the same issues: human-wildlife conflict, poaching for body parts, the pet trade, snares being left out. The same issues recur over and over, regardless of the species. We just, as humans, seem to think we've got the right to rule and govern and exploit every other animal on this planet. It's been a huge learning curve for me, and a huge disappointment to just see how humans can behave sometimes, I guess, is the way to put it. So to summarize, the conservation goes in waves. There are pockets of success in some places. It's almost, but I often say to people, I think we're fighting a giant forest fire, which is all the issues animals are facing. And we are a powerful hose fighting that, but we're alongside a lot of other powerful hoses also fighting that fire. And I guess it's like, in some points we're dampening down, a particular patch in some points, and then we turn around and over our shoulder there's another one flaring up that we hadn't even thought about. So, but if we all stopped, there would be no hope. We can't stop. Conservationists cannot stop, because if we do, literally the planet will be overrun by humans and concrete, and there'll be nothing left. So, and that will impact us as well. We rely on the biodiversity of this planet to give it lungs, and people don't stop and think about that as much as they should.
Well, I think that's always the thing. It's this such a massive encroachment, on nature. Not only necessarily in places like Africa, where it's where it might be quite obvious, but even here at home, I find that there there are less and less like nature reserve, fewer and fewer nature reserves, for example, and things like that. It's I look at the expansion of some of our cities, especially the city of Milton Keynes where I used to live. It's I moved away from there 11 years ago, and and it seems like the city's bursting out of all seams, in all directions. It just seems like this, everything gets concreted over, and nature is the one that's the bit that suffers. Um, what were the biggest challenges that for you when you in order to get that first book launched? What was like the thing that presented the biggest challenge for you?
Um, I think that, well, as I said, because I was doing everything for the first time, and so it's interesting now we've done it 11 times. But how to set up a Kickstarter campaign, how to make sure that you get the postage right, real detail that actually can make a huge difference if you get it wrong. How to spread the word and get awareness, how to persuade photographers who've never heard of you to trust you with their images and to make sure that you look after them. So yeah, multiple challenges, but equally, as I said before, fortunately, my kind of business and marketing background, helped me along that journey for sure. But trying to do something when you're unknown is one challenge, and we overcame that and got going. What I worry about now is how to keep up interest. After we're no longer the novelty. When I remember that first year, someone wrote to me, one of our photographers, and said, "Oh, everyone's talking about remembering elephants," and I was just at Main Crossing in the Masai Mara, and a couple of photographers were talking about it and discussing whether they were in it or not. But when you're no longer new and you're mainstream, how do you keep up that interest? So that's my biggest challenge now is how to keep going and trying to keep it fresh and keep people enthused. So yeah, different challenges along the way.
I mean, you're 11 books in, so it seems like the concept seems to be working, just at a base level.
Yes, it's true. And my friends tell me off because I always like, particularly when we're starting a Kickstarter, I kind of don't sleep for the few nights before because I just think, what if no one's there? But fortunately, people seem to love the concept so much. There are people that write to me saying, no matter what you make a book on, Margot, I'll be there and I will buy it and I will support you. And that means so much to me. And really, an engaged community of supporters and photographers and conservationists is everything. And that's what's been unexpected for me. We've created this community which again, I never set out to create, and I had no idea it could be created, and that's been pretty wonderful.
That reminds me very much of of this podcast, really, in many ways, because it was the same thing for me. I didn't set out to create a community at all. Turns out 300 episodes later, there are people who actually listen to this thing. But
That's wonderful.
it's one of these things. I think in that respect, it's very similar. You start out with an idea because you believe in it, and you want to make it happen. um, and you don't really have this sort of wide angle view, photographically speaking, in the beginning to really understand where this could lead to, like 11 years down the line. Which I find fascinating to see how things like these develop and grow over time.
Yeah, and I think it is just testament to, when you have a good idea, just putting one foot in front of the other over and over and keeping going. I think you can't underestimate just, putting your effort into something and just keeping going, where it can get you.
How did you scale this? Actually, this is a just for my own interest, really. How did you scale this from a book, like a single book, to like a global initiative?
Um, again, I want to say it just happened. I mean, I suppose one of the things that has made a massive difference for us is social media, and the fact that it feels like things are changing in the world of social media right now is interesting, and also one to watch as far as I'm concerned. But we never paid for advertising; it was all the power of word of mouth, and each of our photographers who've been involved had global followers. So it very quickly, it wasn't just a UK based thing. I had photographers who were American, Australian, you name it, photographers from all over, certainly from Africa as well. And each of them were maybe photographic tour leaders who'd taken guests from all over the world. And, once they heard about us, that they came on board too. So I think social media makes the world a much smaller place, and and allows for sharing immediately in a way that if we'd done this 15 years ago, maybe we probably wouldn't have reached so many people.
Is it sometimes, is it like a two-sided sword? Because I can imagine that creating, creating movement like this sort of leads to more people wanting to go and see elephants, let's say, in the wild, which then leads to an increase in tourism, which then comes with its own problems. Is that sort of an after effect, or does the benefit outweigh um, the uh, the problems?
I'm not aware that we have single-handedly created a surge in demand for safari tourism. I think that would be overestimating our power, and also there's a lot of people who support us. They're buying a book for 40 to 60 pounds, depending on which the book is. So that's a very different expense to going on safari to Africa. And so a lot of people say they buy the books because it gives them a glimpse as to the beauty of nature that they'll never get to see. Um, but safari, as I said earlier, is an important way of bringing income into areas. But it does need to be to well managed and ethical places that people go on safari. So I'd encourage everyone to do their research and make sure that the tour operators they're traveling with, the lodges have got good credentials in terms of what they give back and how they kind of make sure that they're um, showcasing the wildlife in a way that's ethical for that wildlife, for sure. But those places need travelers. But equally, we learned during COVID that that income source as tourism is unreliable and can't be counted on. And so, actually, there need to be other ways of raising money for the conservation of those animals that isn't just reliant on tourism. And obviously, we are one source of funding, which isn't tourism related, or largely isn't. Although we do run a few trips ourselves, but yeah, there's a whole mix of money comes in. But no, I'm not worried that we've created some monster in terms of travelers. I hope we've actually educated people about how to be ethical when they travel.
I think that's quite important because I know, there are a number of places that I've been to, certainly, who since the event of Instagram seem to have been completely overrun with, Instagram tourists, so to say. And it's sometimes it's difficult. I mean, there are so many advantages for that particular region. I'm thinking about some places I know in the Arctic, for example, where of course the income is appreciated and potentially well needed. Yet obviously, the impact that that sort of mass tourism has on those places can be quite um, substantial. And I notice it's a fine balance between the two, just in general.
Yeah, no, certainly, and that's not just for wildlife. There's so many, as we see, kind of international tourism destinations that there's a backlash from locals saying the wave of tourists is ruining their place, and I do think it's something that needs to be managed by the powers that be at a local level. So it's interesting when we were doing Remembering Grey Tapes, I was out in Rwanda and I was actually invited to have an audience with the president of Rwanda, Paul Kagame, which I was a bit unexpected, but a wonderful chance to chat with him. And they had just doubled the price of tourism permits to see gorillas at that point from $750 to $1,500 for an hour with the gorillas. And there'd been a lot of grumbling from people saying that that was, exorbitant and that they'd all go to Uganda because it was half the price still. And I said to him, how has that gone? I think it was like 8 months into going. And he said, the quality of the tourists we're getting is higher, the spend per tourist is higher, and the pressure on the gorillas is lower. And we're a third up in revenue compared to a year ago. So he said, as far as I'm concerned, it's working. And there is that whole question mark about the democracy of access to wildlife and also for local people versus tourists. I don't think it's right to price out local people from seeing the wildlife on their doorstep. But from a kind of tourism perspective, controlling numbers, if economics is the only way to do it, then I don't have a problem with that. I think it's better to do that than to have too many crowds killing places. So yeah, but it's something that's a global issue. But equally, as I hinted on earlier, there's a lot of backlash against social media, and we're looking at bans for kind of under 16s going on, and I'm seeing more people turn away and spending less time on social media than I have for a long time. So I wonder if we're about to see a bit of natural self-selection away from it, even, which will be very interesting to see how that plays out.
It's interesting. I have 3 kids, uh, aged 14 to 23, and it's especially with the 2 older ones. It's interesting how their attitudes towards social media have changed over the last 6, 7, 8 years. Whilst when they were teenagers, they were complete addicts. It's like you could have replaced the word social media with or Instagram, I think, at a time, and TikTok maybe, with the word heroin. It would have been the same effect, in terms of addiction. Um, but it's interesting how even their attitudes towards social media have changed. They're a lot more suspect now, and I think my my middle daughter, she's 21. She's actually, I think she's deleted her Instagram account, I think, which I found incredible, really. I mean, given how addicted she was, only a few years ago. So
Yeah.
there's definitely a shift happening, even like in that age group as well, which I find very interesting, actually, because you know,
Yeah, yeah, and I was with a friend's, teenage daughters the other day, and one of them was 15, and she was talking about having been in a car with another of her friend's mothers, and that mother was on Facebook, and my friend's teenager said, "I've never even been on that app." Literally never been on Facebook, like it was some strange thing, it's for old people, um, so yes, I wonder, let's get together in 10 years and see what's happening at that point.
well, absolutely, yeah. Right, I want to talk a little bit about the photography itself, because I think, wildlife photography is one of these things that I say this whenever I have a wildlife photographer on the show. Just for total transparency, I am by far the worst wildlife and landscape photographer there is, without a shadow of a doubt.
Okay.
Um, but while I mean, I love looking at wildlife photographs, and to me, from a technical perspective, I can understand how you can create, I wrote a comment, a decent wildlife shot. But what is it that makes a photograph powerful enough to inspire action by others?
Um, that's an interesting question because when I'm selecting images for our books, I'm not necessarily trying to inspire action. I'm trying to showcase the beauty of what we're in danger of losing. So what I do with remembering is use beauty to bring people in. And one of the reasons I use it in that way is inspired by a friend of mine years ago who told me whenever she saw a difficult image, of an animal that had been poached or was in trouble or hurt, she found it so upsetting that she would turn over the page or flick onto the next thing and wouldn't look at it. And I thought, I can't have people look away. I need them to see what's going on here. So actually, I'll draw them in with the magic of what's still out there that needs to be saved, and then educate them through the words that we use in our books. So our books showcase the most beautiful images. Our ambition always is to make the most beautiful book ever seen on that particular species. But then we have essays from leading conservationists who talk about the actual issues that are going on and try and educate people in that way. So I suppose, for me, I'm not trying to necessarily inspire action. There is another kind of cohort of photographers out there, some of whom we've worked with as well, who really do specialize in those more difficult graphic images that are haunting and upsetting, and put them in front of the right person, and that can make a difference. I feel I talked about preaching to the converted earlier. I do feel sometimes showing those images to people who kind of work in conservation already and kind of know that that's what goes on, you know, is it going to make much of a difference? So putting my PR hat on from years ago, you have to have an end goal in mind and a behavior change in mind. So put those images in front of people that are, politicians or change makers, or, show it at big conferences where people are voting on things. Maybe that's how to do it. But my approach is a bit different, as you can understand, I think.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because both of these approaches may very well work. One is making people realize the beauty that we can lose or about to lose if things don't change. Um, it's almost looking at a world of the past. The other approach is the shock and awe approach, where you literally shock people into waking up and realizing that this is what's happening. Um, and I guess they can be equally effective. I suppose it just depends on the audience. I'm wondering which approach would work to change policy because that's often at the basis of it. When I'm guessing when if you're trying to um, to achieve real change.
Yeah, I mean, again, as I say, I think there is a place for those images. So, say if your ambition is to change policy, you're actually targeting a relatively small number of decision makers. So, make sure you get to those people with those images for sure. And yeah, and sometimes illustrating what's going on out there, that raises public awareness. So it definitely has a place for itself, but it's say I tend to only have one image, as I call it, as a kind of conservation type image in each book. I don't want to have things that are going to um, uh, make people not want to go through the books. My target is to try and get. Yeah, I always say it's a 10-year-old girl and her grandmother is the target audience for our books. So people will enjoy those books and want to learn about them. But it's interesting. I recently actually recorded an audio book of all of the essays from the 10 books into one audio book, which is just over 5.5 hours. It's called Voices for the Vanishing, and so I had to go back over some of that kind of written material from years ago that I haven't read for a long time. And I was talking about in the Great Apes book, there is a picture of a gorilla being carried on a makeshift kind of platform. He was called Senkwekwe, and the photo is by Brent Sturton, a very famous National Geographic photographer, and he let us use that image. And he had been murdered in a conflict with humans, and there was crowds around watching. And in that voiceover that I had to record of the essay, I remember it very clearly saying, I'm still haunted by this image because it looks like a human funeral, but it's for a gorilla, a mountain gorilla. So images like that can haunt you, for sure. But finding the average person be able to get access to opportunities like that, it isn't easy, and operating in dangerous places. So most wildlife photographers are not going out to seek images like that. They're actually going out to document the beauty of what's out there, I think.
Now, you've worked with many of the leading wildlife photographers around today, and you put 11 books together. Um, what impact has that had on your own photography?
Um, I mean, it's probably made me more and more insecure about my own photography, to be honest. Because when you're looking at portfolio after portfolio by some of the best photographers in the world, and then you look back at your own and you think, my goodness, I can't rank with these people. But equally, there are things like I talk about, like the images I'm drawn to, particularly when we're putting together a book and we're choosing from people's portfolios, surprisingly to me, are more often the landscape pictures that really show a sense of place and the context for an animal. And yet I'm very guilty of my go-to lens is my 400 prime 2.8, which is a thing of beauty and I love. And so I get the most beautiful portrait shots from that. But then when I'm looking at other people's images for the books, the ones that give you a sense of place and tell a story are the ones often like a tiger stretching on a fallen tree, and a tiger in a jungle in Ranthambore, and you just see the beauty of the place and the context within it. So I think that's one of the biggest lessons I try and keep reminding myself when I get out into the field, which is not as often as I would like nowadays, but to try and think about showing a sense of place and not just grabbing the 400 and doing a portrait.
That's actually a really interesting aspect, and I think I'd be guilty of that, just the same. Because I remember I went on a sea eagle safari in the Lofoten Islands in Arctic Norway um, a couple of years ago, and I really don't have any experience with wildlife photography at all, let alone lenses like that. And I think I was shooting a 400, which was an interesting experience. But you're right. I mean, my instinct was I want to get as close to these eagles as possible and get those close up shots of the eyes and all the rest of it. Um, and I think I made that cardinal mistake myself. Just forgetting to actually place that bird in its natural environment, so to say. So I can see how easy it is to just fall for that trap, completely. But it's also there's a sense of wonder. That's the first time I've ever seen the seagull in nature. I was just like I was more perplexed than anything. I'm surprised I could even take photos. You know?
Yeah. No, I was gonna say, I mean, there is a stage that you have to go through, that sense of awe when you're first seeing a wildlife, is a wonderful thing to be cherished and enjoyed, but, you do, have to then get to a point, and what I would say is a lot of these pros are so seasoned that, they know what magazine editors are looking for. They're getting the portrait and the landscape, kind of setup of the camera, and they're going wide and they're going long, and that they're getting the whole variety. Whereas, when people are experiencing something for the first time, they're just amazed they can photograph anything. So they're shooting with their heart, not their head. And I think that's what the pros are able to do is shoot with their heads.
How's that changed for you when you go on a safari now? I mean, compared to like the first time you went. Yeah, I can imagine the first time we went on a safari, it was like, ooh, there's a leopard. Awesome. I've seen a leopard.
Yeah.
Um, but now you mentioned storytelling, which I think is super important in photography in general, particularly in wildlife photography. Um, what role does storytelling play in creating these impactful wildlife images?
Well, I suppose it's, you're naturally drawn, any photographer, you're sitting there in a context and you've got a leopard or elephants in front of you, and, you're starting to think, what am I trying to say with this picture rather than just, grabbing it. So, um, I mentioned we run a few conservation safaris a year, and we had a group out in South Luangwa in Zambia in June, and it was a leopard safari we billed it as, and we were working with the local Zambian Carnival project to raise funds for them. And so we did go and photograph a lot of the leopards that we could find. But the picture that I most remember taking and talk about the most often now is a herd of elephants who were crossing across the river and leaving the safety of the park and going to what's called a game management area where humans and animals coexist, and where they're potentially going to be shot at because they're going to come into conflict with humans. And there was a guy walking along the bank on that side who was kind of very aware of the danger that elephants could pose to him. So he was being super cautious. And there's a picture of him, and he's kind of standing on the bank looking over at them, and the elephants are all huddled in a way that when you know elephant behavior, they're kind of anxious because they've seen that there's a human on foot and it's not safe for them. And for me, that picture tells 1,000 times more of a story than the pretty leopard I got, on a branch with some pretty light on it as well. So it's what kind of sparks my brain off now is what's most interesting to me. The other thing that has changed a lot is that after a decent amount of time of spending time in those wild places, there are circumstances, there are the pictures everyone wants to nail. So, for example, a leopard in a tree, and you know, the, there you go. You all want to get a leopard in a tree picture, and that's beautiful. But when it's your 100th leopard in a tree, it's you kind of think, well, yeah, it's nice, but it's that branch is a bit ugly and then slightly in front of its face in a way that last week's leopard didn't have one. So I pick up the camera less and less because I can kind of discern when an opportunity is truly special versus, not maybe as good as one I've already got from a previous opportunity. So you become more discerning in the images you take. And so I take a lot less pictures now for sure.
I always find looking at other photographers' images is a great learning experience, especially when you have the opportunity to look at work that is of such an outstanding quality. To me, I always find that that certainly has made me a better photographer over time. Even just having these conversations, with people on the show, I've
Yeah.
learned an unbelievable amount of stuff in areas of photography that I don't normally deal with on a day to day basis. Um, do you do you feel that that has helped you improve your eye, when it comes to wildlife photography in general?
Um, for sure, and I think it is just it's amazing. So you go through. We did our image selection for remembering giraffes last week. So we had sort of 60 portfolios from top photographers, and ranging from, I think, one only sent 2 images, and another sent 300. And you're working through, but um, I can very quickly pull out the golden nugget within all of those images, and so applying that same kind of discipline that I have to have in image selection and curation for our books, I can then kind of apply it against my images, which is why, as I said, what's probably happened is that I've become a lot more insecure about my images. So
Yeah.
I'm kind of, I'll look back at them, and on the day I'll think I'm doing well. And then I'll look back and think, no, none of those are really any good because, I now kind of have an eye for what's truly special. And it's you don't get it every day. No one can expect to go on safari and come back with 500 amazing pictures. If I go away for a week, 10 days, if I get one image a day that I'm happy with, I think that's a good hit rate. And that again comes back to being discerning and only showing your best work, and not just, again, that kind of danger that people have in the early stages on social media by showing too much, just hoping to get feedback by how many likes they get for an image. But if you don't put out your best work, then people start to think, they judge you as a, general photographer based on everything you put out rather than the few, special images you should be putting out.
That's actually also true in street photography, as I've learned. Where when one of the things I used to think about a lot, a few years ago was, whenever I have an opportunity to go into London, for example, to do some street photography, I'd come back with like hundreds of images, and I'd feel like there are hardly any keepers in that. And yet, when I look at other people's work, there's like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of images that are outstanding, and you start to measure yourself against that. When, however, when you have a conversation, with said photographers, you very quickly realize that they go out on a daily basis shooting thousands of images, and what you see in the book that they've just released or something is really just the absolute creme de la creme, the top of the like tip of the iceberg type of work. And what you don't see is the thousands, tens of thousands of images that have, you know, graced the floor of the cutting room, basically. And that's, I think,
Yeah.
to me, that's made me realize how much effort and work actually has to go into creating outstanding images. Which I find whenever I see things like the wildlife photographer of the year exhibition in London, for example. Um, those shots are unbelievable, and I think about how much effort and time, has gone into creating those images, and it's unbelievable.
Yeah, but also sometimes the effort and time has just gone into learning the craft and being out there, not necessarily getting that image. Sometimes, I know photographers who've had images placed, and, it was just luck that they happened to be there at the right moment in time to get that. But if they hadn't invested all of that other field craft in, their learning curve to get to that point, they wouldn't have had their wits about them to get that image at the time. The other thing I was just thinking when you were talking is, even with those street photographers who maybe are showing hundreds of great pictures, of which they're a fraction of their thousands. I was just running through in my head, like, some of the most famous photographers we've worked with. They're probably all known for a handful of images. Like, if you really think about photographers, most photographers make their name by, if there's 4, 5, 6, they're doing well. Most photographers you think of, even the most famous in the world who've, been documented for decades, there's 1 or 2 standout images, which are the ones that they're known for. So, to really reach that pinnacle of, memorability for an image is rare. So again, people don't quantity is maybe you need some quantity to just kind of see what filters to the top. But again, be careful. It's more people judge you on the whole balance of your portfolio.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've certainly learned is that, through experience, the whole like rinse and repeat attitude in a sense. It's I can get to the result quicker now than I could 15 years ago. I'm a portrait photographer, so when I'm shooting a campaign, I can get to the hero image quicker now, but it's still one out of X amount of different images. It's I've
Yeah.
just learned how to what it takes to path the way to get to that hero image, more quickly. That's the experience part, and the um, and having done for so many years and so often. I think, y the thing that fascinates me about wildlife photography, I have to say, is that often when I speak to, wildlife photographers, it's the sheer amount of knowledge. It's actually similar to landscape photographers, really, the sheer amount of knowledge that goes into, understanding a particular species, for example, and knowing behavioral patterns, and knowing the environment and knowing when to be where, and still, I mean, you're still obviously, you're still down to luck because, as you said earlier, it might just not be the day that anything happens. Um, but I'm always fascinated by how much in-depth knowledge and information has to go into creating that kind of imagery. I find it fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly makes a huge difference to know animal behavior. So, I mean, I give a lot of talks, and there's one image that I often show of a big male lion interacting quite comically with a young cub at a water hole. And there's kind of nice framing of grass behind them. So, and the kind of the male is looking at this cub, and the cub is kind of looking a bit kind of apologetics to his dad, who is just upset. But we got that image by finding a pride of lions asleep on the remains of a buffalo kill that they'd been feasting on all morning. In the midday sun, it was hot, and we knew that there was no image there of sleeping lions on a dead buffalo. But I know that lions will want to drink after eating a meal like that, particularly in a hot day. So we looked around, we saw this water hole was 300 meters away. We drove over there. We went to the other side because I know that lions will walk the shortest distance. So they will literally go from point to point of the water. So we parked exactly opposite, anticipating that this lion would walk through the grass and come and eventually, well, any lion, it wasn't that particular lion, but a lion would come and drink. So we'll just park up. And other safari vehicles were coming over and saying, well, there's something going on over there. Why are you parked there? And we were like, no, there's nothing here. We're just waiting. So most vehicles came in, and the tourists kind of saw their sleeping lions and took some pictures that won't be usable in any way, and then left. And we waited over an hour at that watering hole in the blazing sun. And luckily, it just started to cloud over a bit, which made the light better. When this male lion came up and came over and started drinking, and then sure enough, the cub kind of followed, and then I got this lovely moment. So I often talk about with wildlife photography making pictures rather than taking pictures. That the picture I could have taken was some sleeping lions on a dead buffalo, but I made that picture by going over and parking and understanding the behavior and what would happen and getting all my settings ready and anticipating it. So there is, and if you don't have that knowledge because you haven't spent the time out there, go with a photographic guide or a camp guide who understands photography, who will know the same, will try and get you to the point where the light, the camera isn't pointing straight into the light, and that where the animal's going to go, so you can predict that cheetahs might go up on a mound, for example, or I've got another picture of an elephant calf that following the herd and kind of following its mum, because I know they'll always kind of trot behind. So yeah, it can make a huge difference. That said, one of my best known pictures is of two leopards drinking at a water hole in the central Kalahari, in Botswana, a place where the density of leopards is so low that you never see leopards. You don't expect to see leopards. And I had been on a game drive. It was just me and a guide. It was about 40 degrees still at 6 o'clock in the afternoon. It was burning down on us in an open vehicle. And I said to him, I actually we're not going to find anything. It's too hot and I'm burning here. So let's go and park in the shade by a waterhole and I'm going to do some birding. So we were sat pointing at the waterhole. My camera was set up at 800 mil because I was trying to get birds, but it was resting on the bonnet. I was sitting in silence, using binoculars and looking at the bird book and going back and forth in this way. The guide and I hadn't spoken for like 30 minutes. We were just kind of absorbing the moment. And suddenly, through this long grass, this female leopard's head appeared. And she would have known we'd been there the whole time and she would have been assessing us and how safe she felt. But we were so far away and the camera was so set up that eventually she timidly came in and started drinking. And the light was glorious. It was just that golden hour light. And so I was able to very quietly lift that camera up and start shooting without sudden movement or disturbing her or anything. And I knew that was a special moment and say, like, now I've got so much experience that some moments, are so good because you just don't see a leopard there that I was kind of giving myself a talking to, saying, make sure you're getting this right. Your camera settings are right. The camera is switched on. We were joking about not pressing record at the beginning of the podcast, but it's the same thing. Like sometimes it's so good that you could just fire and kind of then look back and see you haven't recorded anything or captured anything. And then I blinked and thought, I'm seeing double. I was so absorbed in the moment that I couldn't quite understand what was going on. And her sub-adult cub came in. So I had two of them drinking. And I've got both of their eye contact. And the cub has got different coloured eyes to its mother. And the tongues are both the same position. And that is nothing to do with behaviour. Because if you'd asked me in my very experienced way, would I see leopards at that waterhole, I would have laughed at you. But all the fieldcraft I said I had before and experience meant I was able to then capture the image when it came along. So yeah, there's a lot of luck in wildlife photography, but experience certainly helps.
Now, you've mentioned earlier that things like social media are changing. How how do you get the message out in 2026 when that whole landscape is changing? What does the future hold for PR wise to deliver that message?
Well, it's constantly trying to think of new ways to amplify your story and to reach more people. So my old PR world, which I left 16, 17 years ago now, was all about, it was kind of pre-social media really. And it was about old fashioned media coverage and getting, coverage on CNN, which we've done for Remembering Wildlife recently, or, BBC News or, international publications. So we still target titles like that with using my experience and you have relationships with journalists who want to cover you. So we try that. Fortunately, we've built up quite a nice database now of previous supporters. So when people buy a book, they join their database. And so it's an easier sell to go back to people who've been a supporter before and say we're still around. You're working with new conservation organizations and they have their databases and talk about you. So it's a whole mixture of trying to stay on top of everything. And we're still active on social media, but I certainly see the likes that we can gather and the reach of it is a lot lower than it used to be. And it's also very clouded by a huge topic, which I'm sure you talked about elsewhere as well. But the proliferation of fake AI images and video now, there's so much of it, and particularly on the video side, there are pictures of people petting lions, from the side of a vehicle, which is a behavior just, you would never, ever condone or encourage, and it's dangerous. And yet those are the ones that get like on social media because people think that's actually happening. And so, it's a minefield of trying to ensure that the truth continues to be seen and understood and that people don't get themselves hurt by, liking things that, are just not happening.
AI is crazy. I see the craziest things. For some reason, um, I end up for some reason like social media platforms seems to be serving me up lots of AI generated raccoon and yeti videos, which I find is it's the most bizarre thing. Have you ever seen those yeti videos? It's a Bigfoot yeti character, completely lifelike, totally photorealistic, who vlogs on his like selfie stick and he gets hunted by human. It's the most bizarre thing. It's something. It's a very big. I mean, I have to. I have to take my hat off when it comes to the creativity of it because said Yeti seems to be buying magic mushrooms from a bunch of rogue drug selling raccoons. It's very bizarre. I don't know who comes up with that kind of stuff, but it's just it's mind blowing how photorealistic it is. So yeah,
Yeah.
I've never really thought about the impact of AI in wildlife photography, but I can from what you were saying, I can see how that could be weird.
Well, yeah, and it's become so realistic now that, like friends of mine who are guides, people will send them videos saying, "Did this actually happen?" So you'll have a leopard leaping in a vehicle and kind of cuddling up to someone who's kind of stroking it, and then people like it. And it used to be that they looked so unrealistic, you could tell immediately. But now they are so realistic that even guides are finding it hard to really see whether that happened or not. So then it comes down to their knowledge of animal behavior and whether that really is a possibility or not. And I think again we're going to have to seek out truth purveyors that we trust, and if they share something, and so the traditional media, like the news outlets that you think you can trust, the BBC, et cetera, would be the ones that, you want to rely on. But, even they're getting into trouble for misrepresenting, news sequences or editing things in a way that can't be true. So, yeah, it's something we all just don't take anything for granted. And that's something, again, I see young people doing a lot better than my generation. Like young people saying, it's probably not true. Do you realize?
It's
And I'm
you're
like,
absolutely
oh,
right.
okay.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because that happens to me all the time. Like, I would see some video on Instagram Reels or on TikTok or something, and I show it to my daughter. I'm like, my youngest daughter. I'm like,
Yeah.
"Oh, look at this. This is amazing." And she was like, "That's that's not real." I'm like, "Oh, it's not. It's quite disappointing now. I'm disappointed. What?"
Exactly. Well, maybe that's where we should take hope that the young generation are far more sensible than us in many ways, and we'll see through the stuff that's fooling us.
Yeah, I mean, but that's a real point, because I think, you mentioned, news outlets like the BBC, for example. It's a really difficult tightrope to walk, I think. On one hand, organizations like the BBC are part of, th they're having to make a stake in the media landscape in order to prove their relevance, against all the other competition that exists now that never existed before, i.e. social media, TikTok, YouTube, whatever else. And so there's I think there's been a drive to more and more sensationalist news, over the last 20 years, let's say. I remember a time when, you would see news items like, cat rescued in local lake. Just like,
Yeah.
oh, that's a great story. You know, you never see anything like that nowadays. Now it's gonna be like, I don't know, somebody bombing somebody else or something. Um, and I feel that pressure leads to risk taking. And AI serves up the perfect ammunition to that because, you see some editors, for instance, go like, well, okay, if we just edit it like this, then, we're telling a story on one hand, but on the other hand, we're also distorting potentially the truth. But it's whether you take that risk or not as an editor is the question. I think because of that pressure of having to stay relevant in today's world, it may be that, some people in some organizations may feel like they need to take that risk more than they actually should. Um, so it's one of my
Yeah.
forever gripes, because I can't watch the news anymore. It's like it's too depressing. To be honest with you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is a huge challenge. And again, everything, even having this discussion makes me just yearn to be in nature again. Because for me, I think about, being surrounded in a kind of meadow full of elephants somewhere on the African plains. And I think, when us humans wipe ourselves out through, whether AI wipes us out or we do it to ourselves by zoonotic disease or something else, the elephants will just carry on as normal, like they always did. And,
Yeah.
you know, true. And in last year's book, we had a pangolin on the cover, and pangolins, as I learned, have been around for 80 million years, and humans have been here for 200,000 years. And if you just think about how much destruction we have caused in that 200,000 compared to, these sweet creatures who, are the most poached mammal on earth, thanks to us. And just, yeah, I kind of feel like humans are a blip, and balance will be restored at some point.
Maybe COVID was the pangolin's revenge.
Well, yes.
In that respect.
Yes, perhaps. Shame they they didn't achieve more with it. Sorry, that's terrible to say. Obviously, as it, what I mean. It's just if you look at the destruction, the small amount of time we've been here, and I hope that conversations like this, make people stop and think, make humanity stop and think that we really do have to do things differently.
Oh, absolutely. Now, if somebody listening to this podcast wants their photography to have impact, where should they start?
I think it's about trying to draw on what skills and knowledge they have, from their particular situation. So, as I said, I sat and thought, I have an image here that of a poached elephant, and it's not a unique image. There are plenty of other poached elephants out there, but what can I do to amplify this? And I used it to trigger something else. So, but at a more basic level, if you can find ways to sell your images to raise money for conservation organizations, or, you think it is telling a story that hasn't been told before, then, get on to media. Or, I mean, it's trying to find an application for the particular situation, really. And one of the things people have said to me is that they appreciate what remembering wildlife has given them as an opportunity to give back in a way that they didn't know how to use their images before. So, again, use their images to support other movements and organizations. I was actually donating images to Born Free Foundation a long time before I did Remembering Wildlife. They had approached me and were using them in their marketing. And there's lots of organizations out there that, whatever walk of life you're in, I'm sure would appreciate some photography. And I've even, like, a friend I've made who I met at the photography show last year when we exhibited there, and he happened to live locally to me, so we met up. So he's more of a corporate and kind of portraits photographer, and he's come along to talks I've given and a podcast recording we're doing, and donates his time for free, giving us images. So he's supporting me using his skills, which are not wildlife photography, but he's supporting the greater cause. So again, think what it is that you can offer to someone else or an organization, and offer it.
But that's again, that's a good point, because I think a lot of photographers probably think, oh, I can't afford to travel to, Central Africa or something. But I think the real question is, uh, you know, uh, can impact start locally? Do you have to travel to the other side of the planet in order to make an impact or make a difference?
Yeah, but again, it depends on what. Find a story you want to tell or a cause you want to back. And there are plenty of conservation issues. If wildlife and conservation is the thing that drives you in the UK, certainly, that can do with a voice. So yeah, find your story, I guess, and then work out how to tell it.
Now, we've talked a lot about the impact of things like poaching on on wildlife today, and but is there anything that gives you hope in the fight for like wildlife conservation today?
It's honestly, having been very rude about humanity, it's the humans I've met along the way. There are some fantastic conservationists out there working thanklessly, in incredibly difficult circumstances. I've become friends with many, and sometimes they'll tell me the issues that they faced that week or that month, and I'll say, "How do you keep going?" And they say, "Well, I just have to. If I don't, what hope is there then?" And so it's the human spirit to not give up, and to make a difference, that it gives me hope. And then you'd say that the pockets of success stories where there've been translocations, we funded some translocations of wild dogs into Malawi, and now there are kind of second and third generations of wild dogs there as a result of those translocations. And yeah, all sorts of projects where there have been poaching incidents in a place because we helped give some sort of community funding that, where it was bad before. And so, yeah, it's just, you have to take hope from the pockets of success and from the people, and and also the younger generation really do seem to care, and, are empowered to fight and stand up for what they think is right and wrong. And, I think the baton of where, conservation is gonna go is to them, so they give me hope too.
My daughters always say to me, like, our generation has to clean up all the mess that your generation created. And I remember I used to say exactly the same thing to my parents. And so that gives me hope.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Oh dear, but it's true, it's true.
Yeah. So if listeners had to remember one thing from this conversation, what would it be?
I think that, getting behind a movement, getting involved gives you a sense of purpose, gives you a sense of community, and allows you to achieve more than any of us can by ourselves.
Perfect. Well, before we finish off this episode, we'll finish off with a quick fire round. 6 questions. Very quick question, very quick answer. Um, One wildlife photographer everyone should study.
Federico Veronese. I think he is the most outstanding wildlife photographer working in the field today.
The most powerful wildlife image you've ever seen.
Probably that elephant on Victoria Falls that I mentioned by Marcel van Oosten, because the sense of place that it gives you, this elephant that looks tiny on the top of the magnificent Victoria Falls, the sense of history of that place, it's a hauntingly beautiful image.
All right, one species that worries you the most today.
Gosh, that's hard. I mean, we've just finished working on the pangolin book, and pangolins, as I said, have been around for 80 million years, and they are the most poached mammal on this planet. They are being wiped out in their millions, and they are so small and trusting and defenseless. It breaks my heart.
Um, Mirrorless DSLR doesn't matter.
For me and wildlife, mirrorless, the fact that it's completely silent makes a huge difference for me. And I do also very much appreciate being able to see live what I've taken rather than having to, adjust my settings subsequently. But the silence of mirrorless is priceless.
What's the one place that every wildlife photographer should experience at least once?
I I hate to say it because this is creating the beast, or fanning the beast, but the Masai Mara is the most beautiful landscape of anywhere in the world, as far as I'm concerned. Just like urgent to try and go off season to spread out the load of people, because it's very overwhelmed, and I hope they get the numbers under control.
Last question. One thing photographers can do today to make a real difference.
Just keep trying to think of the stories that need to be told. As I think it's just repeating myself slightly, but find a purpose for your photography. Uh, if you want to make a difference. If you don't want to make a difference and you just enjoy the craft of losing yourself in a camera, then that's also okay. I think that's the thing. People, it's a way of switching off and enjoying yourself and stretching yourself. And so I think people don't have to make a difference with their photography if they don't want to, but if they do, then find a purpose and really focus on it.
Fantastic. Margot, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for being the guest on the Camera Shake podcast this week.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's been a really interesting conversation. So the Kickstarter to fund Remembering Giraffes runs until Sunday, the 26th of April. On there, you can not only pre-order the book at a discount, but you can also get other giraffe-related goodies and even some safaris at a huge discount. We'd massively appreciate the support. So if you just Google Remembering Giraffes Kickstarter, come on over. We'd really, really appreciate it.
There you have it, Margot Raggett. If this episode got you thinking a little differently about your photography, about what it could be, and the kind of impact it could have, then that's exactly what this show is all about. And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and let us know your biggest takeaway in the comments below. I'd love to hear how you think photography can go beyond just taking pictures and actually make a difference. And don't forget, you can support the show by buying us a coffee over at buymeacoffee.com/camerashake. And you can check out our latest merch over at camerashakepodcasts.com. As always, thank you so much for listening and watching. And why not check out this next episode right here? I think you're going to enjoy that one just as much. You have to be on YouTube, by the way, to see that because, that doesn't work on audio. Anyway, until next time, keep shooting, keep creating, and keep pushing your photography to the next level. As always, I will see you next Thursday.